Don't touch that key. You were never supposed to see it again, the little girl said. Her voice so calm it cut through the silence like a blade of truth as the grand doors of the Carter estate slowly closed behind her, and every polished surface of the marble foyer seemed to reflect a moment that had already been buried for years. William Carter stood near the center of the room, tall and immovable, a man whose name was printed on glass towers across Manhattan. Yet for a brief second, he did not move at all, because in his hand rested a small, old brass key worn at the edges as if it had traveled through time itself. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the child in front of him, Maya Johnson, a 7-year-old black girl standing barefoot on imported stone floors that had never once known silence like this. And beside him, Evelyn Hart shifted uncomfortably, her expression carefully controlled, but her fingers tightening around her leather folder as though she already understood what was coming even if she refused to say it aloud. William finally broke the silence, his voice low and controlled, asking where she had found the key, but Maya did not flinch, did not look away. She simply stepped forward one small pace and said she didn't find it. It found her, and something in the way she said it made the air in the room feel heavier, like the house itself had begun to listen. Evelyn immediately intervened, insisting the child should be taken out of the room, that this was nonsense, a misunderstanding, but William raised a hand without taking his eyes off the key, and for the first time in years the authority in his gesture did not feel like control, it felt like hesitation. Maya looked up at him, her expression steady, almost too steady for her age, and asked softly if he remembered a house near the river, a house he once visited before the world knew his name, and the question landed not like an accusation, but like a memory being unlocked too quickly. William's grip on the key tightened as something flickered behind his eyes, something he had not allowed himself to see in a long time. A flash of warm light, unfinished laughter, a door that used to creak in a very specific way when opened at sunset. But he said nothing, only stared at her as if trying to decide whether she was real or a fragment of a past he had successfully erased. The room behind them remained still, the chandeliers unmoving, the staff frozen at a distance, as if the entire estate had learned instinctively that what was happening now did not belong to the present. Maya took another step closer and pointed at the key in his hand, telling him it opened something he had forgotten, something that was never supposed to be locked away. And for the first time William felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition without permission. Evelyn's voice broke the tension again, sharper now, demanding answers from the child, but Maya did not look at her. She only kept her eyes on William as if Evelyn did not exist in this moment, as if only the truth mattered and everything else was noise. William slowly lifted the key closer to his face, noticing details he had not seen before, the faint engraving along the shaft, the small initials nearly worn away, and suddenly the weight of it changed, as if it was no longer metal, but memory condensed into physical form. He asked her again where she got it, softer this time, and Maya replied that her mother gave it to her before she stopped coming home, before she said William's name one last time like it meant something he was supposed to understand. That name hit deeper than anything else, and for the first time William's expression faltered, not dramatically, not visibly to the world, but enough that Evelyn noticed and stepped forward again, insisting this conversation end immediately, but William did not hear her anymore. He was no longer in the foyer, no longer in the present at all, because the key in his hand had begun to open something far more dangerous than any locked door. It was opening him. And Maya stood perfectly still, watching him as if she already knew that the hardest part was not what the key opened, but what it forced him to remember when it finally turned. The moment the old brass key rested in William Carter's palm, the entire room felt like it had shifted into a quieter dimension where even breathing seemed to carry weight. And Evelyn Hart immediately stepped forward again with a sharper tone, insisting that the child should not be here, that this entire situation was inappropriate and must end now. Yet William did not respond to her, because his attention was no longer in the present space, but locked entirely on the object he was holding, turning it slightly under the light, as if the angle alone might explain why his chest suddenly felt tight, for reasons he could not justify. While Maya Johnson remained still in front of him, her small hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm in a way that made her presence feel less like a disturbance and more like a return of something forgotten. William finally spoke again, but his voice was quieter now, asking Evelyn if she recognized the key, and she hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long before answering that it was impossible, that nothing like that belonged in his current estate records, that it was likely meaningless, but the lack of certainty in her tone only deepened the silence between them. Maya looked up at William and repeated softly that the key was not meaningless, that it opened the place he used to go when he was not a billionaire, when he was just someone who used to laugh more easily. And as she said it, William felt a subtle but undeniable shift in his memory, like a door inside his mind had been nudged open without permission, revealing something he had long kept sealed away. For a brief moment, he saw it, not clearly, but enough to unsettle him. A wooden gate near a slow river, sunlight reflecting off water in a way that felt warmer than anything in his current life, and a woman's voice calling his name from somewhere just out of frame. But the image disappeared as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the weight of the key in his hand and the uncomfortable realization that he had reacted to something he could not fully remember. Evelyn noticed his change in expression and immediately tried to regain control of the situation, suggesting again that Maya be escorted out, that this was becoming disruptive. But William raised his hand once more, not out of authority this time, but out of hesitation, as if stopping the world from moving forward until he could understand what was happening inside him. He asked Maya where her mother had gotten the key, and Maya replied that it had always been part of their home, that her mother said it belonged to someone important who once promised never to forget. And at that phrase, William felt something inside him tighten again, not painful, but deeply unfamiliar, like recognition without context. Evelyn finally stepped closer and lowered her voice, telling William that old objects often carry stories that people misunderstand, that this was likely a coincidence. But William interrupted her gently for the first time, asking her directly if there had ever been a property connected to him that was never fully documented, something off the record, something near a river that was no longer listed in any of his holdings. The question made Evelyn freeze for just a second, and that single moment of silence was enough for William to notice. Maya did not speak again. She simply watched him, as if waiting for him to choose whether to continue resisting or finally begin remembering. And William found himself unable to ignore the way the key felt warmer now, almost like it was reacting to his grip, grounding him in a past he could not fully access. He slowly turned away from both of them and looked toward the long corridor of his estate, as if expecting answers to appear within the architecture he had built from certainty and control. But instead there was only silence, and within that silence a growing realization that something in his life had been deliberately left incomplete. Evelyn tried once more to guide him back to logic, suggesting that stress and time often distort memory. But William was no longer listening in the same way, because for the first time he was not trying to defend what he knew. He was beginning to question what had been taken from him. Maya finally spoke again, very softly, saying that her mother told her this moment would come, that he would feel confused at first, but that the key would show him what words could not. And William looked at her with an expression that was no longer purely analytical, because something deeper had begun to surface, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, uncertainty tied to something unspoken. And as the three of them stood in the vast quiet of the mansion, the space between truth and denial grew thinner, until it felt like the next answer would not come from words at all, but from wherever that key truly belonged. William Carter stood motionless for several seconds after Maya's words faded into the silence, his gaze fixed on the old brass key as if it had suddenly become heavier than anything he had ever held. And for the first time in years he felt a subtle discomfort that no financial report, no negotiation, and no boardroom decision had ever managed to create inside him. While Evelyn Hart remained slightly behind him, her posture rigid, her eyes shifting between the child and the key as though calculating how quickly she could regain control of a situation that was slipping beyond her authority. William finally turned his head slightly toward Evelyn and asked in a calm but unusually strained voice whether there had ever been a property under his family name that was removed from official records, something that never appeared in the public archives or corporate filings. And the question alone made Evelyn pause longer than she should have, her hesitation revealing more than any answer could, because for a brief moment her composure fractured just enough for William to notice. Maya stepped closer without fear, her small shoes making no sound on the polished floor, and she looked up at William with steady eyes before saying that the place was not gone, it was only forgotten, and that forgetting was a choice someone had made a long time ago, not an accident. And as she spoke those words, William felt another flicker of memory, sharper this time, like a corridor of light opening at the edge of his mind. He saw himself standing outside a modest wooden house near a slow river, the air warmer than anything he associated with his current life, and he saw a woman placing something into his hand, something small and meaningful, but the image broke apart before he could hold on to it fully, leaving him with a sense of loss he could not name. Evelyn quickly stepped in again, attempting to redirect the conversation by insisting that childhood imagination often blends with inherited stories, but William interrupted her more firmly this time, asking her to retrieve the full historical property records for every asset that had ever been registered under his grandfather's estate, including any transfers that were never publicly disclosed. The request caused a visible tension in Evelyn's expression, but she nodded with controlled reluctance and moved toward the adjacent study, leaving a silence that immediately felt deeper without her presence. Maya did not move, but her attention remained locked on William as if she already knew what the records would reveal, and William found himself unable to look away from her, because there was something unexplainably familiar in the way she stood, in the quiet confidence that did not belong to her age. Minutes passed slowly, marked only by the faint sound of distant clocks within the mansion, until Evelyn returned with a thin folder that looked older than the rest of the estate's documentation, her expression now more guarded than before, and she placed it carefully on the table without meeting William's eyes. William opened the folder and began to read, and the moment his eyes landed on the faded document inside, his breathing changed slightly, because the paper contained references to a property he had never been told existed, located near a river boundary outside Austin, Texas, registered decades earlier under a trust name that had been quietly dissolved. The address matched the fragment of memory he had seen earlier, and as he continued reading, he noticed a handwritten note attached to the document referencing a woman named Elena Johnson, a name that struck something deeper than recognition, something closer to emotional instinct that had been buried under years of silence. Maya watched him carefully as his expression shifted from confusion to something closer to shock, and she finally spoke again, saying that her mother used to live there, that it was the only place she ever called home, and that before she stopped speaking about it, she told Maya that one day someone would come looking for what was left behind. William closed the folder slowly, his hand lingering on the edge of the paper as if afraid it might disappear, and when he finally looked up at Maya again, the distance in his eyes had changed, replaced by something uncertain and deeply human. Because for the first time, he was not looking at a stranger with a mysterious object. He was looking at a possible answer to a question he had never realized he was still carrying. The mansion around them no longer felt like a symbol of control, but like a structure built over something unfinished. And in that quiet realization, William understood that the key was not just meant to open a place. It was meant to open a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. The silence that followed William Carter closing the folder felt heavier than anything in the room, as if the mansion itself had begun to absorb every word that had just been spoken, and for a long moment, he simply stood there with the old brass key resting in his hand, no longer like an object, but like an unanswered question that refused to leave him alone, while Maya Johnson remained in the same place, calm and steady, watching him with an expression that carried no urgency, only certainty, as though she already knew that the truth was not something that could be rushed, only uncovered. Evelyn Hart finally broke the silence, her voice controlled but sharper now, insisting that William should not allow himself to be influenced by incomplete documents or emotional assumptions, that estates like his had always contained administrative inconsistencies over the years, and that there was no reason to believe any of this connected to anything personal. But William did not respond immediately, because his attention was no longer on her words. It was on the faint details of the folder, still open on the table, especially the name Elena Johnson, which seemed to echo in his mind with a familiarity he could not logically explain. Maya took a small step closer and spoke softly, saying that her mother never used to lie about the past, that she only stopped talking about it when it became too painful to remember, and that before she stopped, she told Maya that there was a man who once promised a future near the river house, a man who would one day forget everything if no one reminded him. William's grip on the key tightened slightly at those words, and this time the memory did not fade immediately. Instead, it lingered longer, forming a clearer image of a woman standing near a doorway holding a small child, sunlight falling across a wooden floor, and a feeling of warmth so unfamiliar it almost felt foreign to him now. Evelyn stepped forward again, attempting to regain authority over the situation, suggesting that the documents should be reviewed by legal counsel before any assumptions were made. But William raised his hand again, not to silence her this time, but to pause her, because something inside him had shifted from doubt into something more uncomfortable, curiosity mixed with recognition. He asked Evelyn directly whether she had ever personally reviewed the complete archival transfers related to the Carter family properties from 20 years ago, and for the first time her response was not immediate, her eyes narrowing slightly before she answered carefully that most of those records had been consolidated and reviewed long ago during corporate restructuring, implying that nothing relevant could possibly remain hidden. But William noticed something in her tone, not deception exactly, but distance, the kind of distance that appears when someone chooses not to look too closely at what they already know might be true. Maya watched the exchange quietly, her gaze moving between them, and then she said something even softer, telling William that the reason she brought the key was not to accuse anyone, but because the door it belonged to could not stay closed forever, and that her mother used to say that some truths wait patiently until the right person finally remembers they exist. The phrase settled in the room like a weight that could not be ignored, and William found himself turning slightly away from both of them, looking instead toward the tall windows of the mansion where daylight filtered in cold and precise, as if the outside world had no idea what was unfolding inside. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask a question he had avoided for years, asking out loud whether there had ever been a private residence registered under a trust that was later dissolved without explanation, and whether anyone had ever been instructed to remove personal correspondence associated with it from official archives. Evelyn hesitated again, and that hesitation was enough for William to realize that the answer was not simple denial, but controlled avoidance. Maya quietly stepped closer to the table and placed her small hand near the folder without touching it, saying that the house still exists in memory even if it was erased from paper, and William felt something inside him tighten again, because he understood now that the key was not pointing toward a place on a map. It was pointing toward a version of himself that he had never fully acknowledged. He looked down at the brass surface again, noticing how the worn edges seemed almost intentional, like it had been held many times by someone before him, and suddenly he felt an unexpected pull, not toward the mansion he had built, but toward something older, quieter, and unfinished. Evelyn finally spoke again, her voice softer now but still guarded, suggesting that even if such a property once existed, revisiting it would not change anything. But William interrupted her gently, saying that avoiding the past had already changed everything, because what was forgotten does not disappear, it simply waits. Maya looked up at him then, and for the first time a faint change appeared in her expression, not relief, but recognition of movement, as if the first door had finally begun to unlock. And in that moment, William Carter understood that the real question was no longer whether the key opened a place, but whether he was finally ready to walk through what it revealed. The atmosphere inside the Carter estate shifted in a way that no one could ignore, as William Carter stood near the long table with the old brass key still resting in his hand, and for several seconds he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because every possible answer felt incomplete compared to the pressure building inside his memory, while Evelyn Hart remained beside him, her posture controlled, but her eyes now showing a rare uncertainty as she watched him slowly make a decision that would move beyond documents, beyond explanations, and into something far less predictable. Maya Johnson stood quietly at the edge of the room, observing without interruption, her presence steady and calm as if she was not waiting for permission but only for recognition. And when William finally spoke, his voice carried a tone that was different from before, less defensive and more resolved, as he said that he needed to see the place connected to the key with his own eyes. Evelyn immediately reacted, insisting that there was no practical reason to pursue something so unclear, reminding him of responsibilities, schedules, and reputations that could not simply be paused for a fragment of memory. But William interrupted her gently, saying that he had spent his entire life trusting structured records and controlled information, and yet none of it had prepared him for the way that one small object had disrupted everything he believed was stable. Maya looked up at him as he spoke, and for the first time there was a subtle change in her expression, not surprise, but quiet confirmation, as if she already knew the decision would eventually come. William turned toward her and asked if she was willing to come with him, and without hesitation she nodded, as if the question had already been answered long before it was asked. Evelyn exhaled slowly, attempting one final time to redirect the situation by suggesting that professionals should handle any investigation into old property records. But William shook his head, saying that this was no longer about procedure. It was about something personal that had been buried long before procedures ever existed. Within the hour, preparations were made with unusual silence for a household that usually operated with precision and urgency. And as William stepped out of the mansion, he no longer felt the familiar weight of control that had defined his life, but instead something unfamiliar and unsettled, like stepping away from a version of himself that no longer felt complete. A black vehicle waited outside the estate gates, polished and discreet, and as William opened the door, Maya followed closely behind him, moving with quiet confidence that contrasted with the tension surrounding the moment, while Evelyn remained behind for several seconds, watching them leave with an expression that suggested both concern and realization that some boundaries had already been crossed. The drive began in silence, the city passing in blurred layers of glass and steel, and William found himself staring at the old key resting in his palm again, noticing how it no longer felt like an isolated object, but like part of a larger story that he had been removed from without consent. Maya sat across from him, her small hands folded calmly, her gaze occasionally shifting toward the window, as if she recognized the direction even without needing confirmation. And after a long stretch of silence, William finally asked her how long she had known about the key, to which she replied that she had known about it since she was very small, but she only understood its importance when her mother stopped speaking about the past altogether. Those words settled in the space between them, and William felt something tighten again in his chest, not discomfort exactly, but recognition of absence, as if entire years of meaning had been missing from his understanding of his own life. The vehicle left the city limits, and the environment gradually changed, glass towers giving way to quieter roads and open stretches of land. And with each mile, William felt the distance between his present life and whatever awaited them increasing in a way that could not be measured by maps or schedules. Evelyn's earlier warning echoed in his mind, not as resistance, but as background noise, because at this point he was no longer debating whether to proceed. He was only trying to understand why he felt so certain that he had to. Maya suddenly spoke again, pointing gently toward the horizon and saying that the river house was not far now, and William followed her gesture, noticing a subtle shift in the landscape that triggered another faint memory, this time clearer than before, of standing near water and hearing a promise spoken in a voice he could no longer fully place. The realization did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, each one connecting to the next like pieces of a forgotten pattern slowly returning to form, and William understood that what he was approaching was not simply a location, but a convergence of everything he had avoided remembering. As the vehicle continued forward, Maya remained calm, her presence steady and unchanged, while William Carter, a man who had built entire worlds through certainty and control, finally accepted that some doors do not open through logic, they open through return. The vehicle slowed as the landscape shifted into a quieter stretch of land where the road narrowed and the trees grew closer together, and William Carter felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he looked out through the tinted window and saw the first glimpse of a river reflecting the pale afternoon light, while Maya Johnson remained calm beside him, her eyes already focused ahead as if she recognized every detail of the place before it fully appeared. The driver brought the car to a gentle stop near an old iron gate partially covered in rust and vines, and for several seconds no one moved, Because what stood beyond the gate did not match the world William had built around himself. It belonged to something older, simpler, and deeply disconnected from the life he knew now. William stepped out first, holding the old brass key in his hand without realizing he had tightened his grip again. And as his shoes touched the uneven ground, he felt a strange sensation of familiarity mixed with distance, like standing in a place he had once known but had been instructed to forget. Maya followed quietly, moving past him without hesitation, and for the first time William noticed how naturally she belonged to this environment, as if the air itself responded differently to her presence. The gate creaked slightly as they approached, and William looked at it closely, noticing the faded wood behind the iron frame, the kind of craftsmanship that no longer existed in modern construction, and something about it stirred another fragment of memory that he could not fully grasp. Maya raised her hand and pointed toward the small house beyond the gate, a modest structure sitting near the riverbank, partially hidden by trees, and she said softly that it was still there, just as her mother described it, waiting for someone who would eventually remember. William did not respond immediately, because his attention had shifted entirely to the house, and as he looked at it, another wave of memory surfaced, stronger than before, showing brief flashes of light through open windows, a woman standing near the doorway, and a feeling of peace that felt foreign compared to everything he had experienced in recent years. He stepped forward slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break the connection forming inside his mind, and Maya walked beside him without speaking, allowing him to process each step in silence. When they reached the front of the gate, William finally lifted the key slightly, studying it under the natural light, noticing now how perfectly it matched the lock that had been waiting there for years, untouched, but preserved as if time itself had chosen not to erase it completely. Maya looked up at him and said that her mother told her this door would only open when the right person stopped pretending not to remember, and those words struck William more deeply than anything else because they did not feel like a challenge. They felt like a truth he had been avoiding for far too long. He placed the key into the lock slowly, and the moment metal met metal, his breath paused without conscious effort, as if his body understood what his mind was still struggling to accept. The turn was not difficult, but it carried weight, and when the lock finally clicked open, a quiet sound spread through the air that felt less like a mechanical release and more like a memory being allowed to breathe again. William pushed the gate open and stepped forward into the property, and as he entered, the atmosphere changed immediately, becoming softer, warmer, and filled with a stillness that contrasted sharply with everything he had known in his modern life. The house stood ahead exactly as Maya had described, simple and weathered but intact, and for a moment William could only look at it in silence because the emotions rising within him had no clear language attached to them. Maya walked a few steps forward and stopped near the pathway, turning slightly to look at him as if waiting for his reaction not with expectation, but with understanding. William finally moved toward the house, each step bringing another fragment of memory into focus, until he reached the front door and placed his hand on the wood, feeling a subtle vibration beneath it that seemed almost like recognition. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment the past no longer felt distant. It felt present, layered over the current reality like a transparent image waiting to become clear. When he opened his eyes again, he did not speak, but the expression on his face had changed, because he was no longer standing in front of an unknown structure. He was standing in front of something he had once left behind, and something inside him finally understood that the key had not brought him to a place. It had brought him back to a truth he had spent his entire life running from. William Carter stood at the threshold of the old house with his hand still resting on the weathered wood of the front door, and for several seconds he did not move, because the silence around him felt different from any silence he had ever experienced in his corporate life. It was not empty or controlled. It was full, as if the air itself was waiting for him to acknowledge something that had been ignored for too long. While Maya Johnson stood a few feet behind him on the pathway, calm and steady, watching without pressure, as though she understood that some moments cannot be rushed without breaking them. William finally pushed the door open, and the soft creak of hinges echoed through the interior like a voice returning after years of absence, revealing a modest living space filled with faded light and untouched stillness, where dust floated gently in the air, and every object seemed to belong to a memory rather than a present reality. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes scanning the room with quiet disbelief. Because although he had no clear recollection of being there, something in the structure of the space felt deeply familiar, like fragments of a forgotten chapter aligning themselves without permission. Maya followed him in, closing the door softly behind them, and the sound seemed to complete a circle that had been open for far too long. William walked further into the room, his gaze landing on a small wooden table near the window, where faint marks suggested it had once been used frequently. And as he approached it, another wave of memory surfaced, clearer than before, showing moments of simple life that did not belong to the version of himself he currently knew. He saw a woman smiling as she placed a cup on that same table, heard distant laughter that felt warm and unguarded, and for the first time the memories did not disappear immediately. They stayed just long enough to feel real. Maya moved quietly to the side of the room and pointed toward a corner where a small framed photograph rested partially hidden beneath a cloth, and William hesitated before approaching it, because something inside him already knew what he would see before he reached it. When he lifted the cloth, he found the image of a younger version of himself standing beside a woman he could now identify as Elena Johnson, both of them near this very house, their expressions unguarded and real in a way that felt foreign to his current life. And in that moment something inside William shifted permanently, because denial could no longer survive the clarity forming in front of him. He stepped back slightly, holding the photograph carefully, and his breathing slowed as the weight of recognition began to settle in fully, not as a single revelation but as a series of truths aligning one after another. Maya watched him without speaking, and when he finally turned to her, his voice was quieter than before as he asked if she had always known he was here, and she nodded gently, saying that her mother never stopped believing this moment would come, even when everything else changed. William looked around the room again, noticing details he had ignored at first, small signs of life preserved in stillness. And he realized that this was not a forgotten place, it was a preserved one, held together by intention rather than chance. He slowly walked toward the window, looking out at the river beyond, and as he did, another memory surfaced, stronger than any before, showing him standing here with Elena, speaking about promises he now understood he had failed to keep. The realization did not come with shock alone, but with something deeper, a sense of loss that had been waiting beneath everything he had built in his life. Maya stepped closer to him and said softly that she was not here to take anything from him, only to show him what was never truly gone. And William closed his eyes for a moment as he tried to reconcile the distance between who he had become and who he had once been in this place. When he opened them again, his expression had changed, no longer driven by confusion or resistance, but by acceptance of something that could no longer be undone. He looked at Maya with a new understanding forming silently between them, and for the first time since arriving, he did not feel like a man chasing answers, but like someone finally standing where his story had always been waiting to continue. The interior of the old house felt still but no longer empty to William Carter, as if every corner had begun to respond to his presence in a way that went beyond physical space. And he stood in the center of the room holding the photograph with Elena Johnson for several seconds without speaking, because the weight of recognition was now too real to dismiss as uncertainty. While Maya Johnson quietly moved closer to the window, her small figure framed by soft daylight, watching him without pressure, as though she had already completed the only task she came to fulfill. William finally lowered the photograph slightly, his voice calm but unsteady as he asked Maya if she understood what this place meant to him, and she replied softly that she did not need him to explain it, because the house had already been explaining it to him since the moment he stepped inside. Her words settled into the room like something precise and final, and William felt the last barrier between memory and reality begin to dissolve. He walked slowly toward the far wall where a set of shelves still held untouched objects, and as his eyes moved across them, he noticed small details that triggered deeper recognition. A ceramic cup with a faint crack on the rim, a faded fabric cover folded neatly, and a small carved object that matched something he had seen earlier in fragmented memory. Each item did not simply remind him of the past, it restored it piece by piece, until the separation between then and now felt increasingly fragile. Maya approached the wooden table again and placed her hand gently on its surface, saying that her mother used to sit there every evening, waiting for someone who always said he would return when things were different, and William felt a subtle tightening in his chest as he realized that those words were not abstract, they were directed at him. He turned slightly away, looking toward the window again where the river moved slowly under soft light. And this time the memory that surfaced was no longer fragmented. It was continuous, showing him standing in this very room with Elena, speaking about a future he had once believed was certain, and the clarity of that moment struck him with quiet force. Evelyn Hart was no longer present in the space, but her earlier voice seemed to echo faintly in his mind, warning him about the instability of memory. Yet William now understood that what he was experiencing was not instability, it was recovery. He placed the photograph back on the table carefully, as if acknowledging that it belonged exactly where it had always been, and then he turned fully toward Maya for the first time since entering the house. Her expression remained calm, but there was something softer in her eyes now, not expectation, but acceptance, as if she had already seen this moment many times in her mind before it happened. William asked her quietly why she brought the key to him instead of anyone else, and Maya replied that her mother told her the truth always returns to the person who left it behind, even if it takes years to find its way back. That answer stayed with him longer than any document or memory, because it removed the last illusion of randomness from everything that had brought them here. He walked slowly to the center of the room again, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time with full understanding, and he realized that nothing in this house had ever been abandoned, only paused. Maya stepped closer and looked up at him, and William finally spoke her name gently, as if acknowledging not just her presence, but her place within a story he had once chosen to forget. The silence that followed was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was complete, and within that stillness William Carter understood that the key had never been meant to open a door alone. It had been meant to return him to a truth that had been waiting here all along, unchanged by time, waiting only for him to remember. The quiet inside the old river house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were no longer holding secrets but releasing them one by one. And William Carter stood in the center of the room with a stillness that no longer came from confusion but from recognition, while Maya Johnson remained near the window where the light touched her gently, her presence steady as if she had always belonged to this exact moment in time. William slowly turned his gaze across the room once more, no longer searching for answers but confirming what he now understood, and when his eyes returned to Maya, there was a change in him that could not be mistaken, because the distance that had defined him for so many years had finally begun to collapse. He took a slow breath and asked her softly what her mother had told her about him, and Maya stepped forward just slightly before answering that her mother never spoke his name with anger, only with memory, and that she always said there was a man who once believed time could be paused if love was strong enough. Those words settled into William more deeply than anything before, because they did not accuse him. They restored him to something he had lost without realizing the cost. He looked down at the old brass key still resting in his hand, and for the first time he no longer saw it as an object of mystery, but as a bridge between two versions of his life that had been separated by silence and years of avoidance. Maya moved closer to the table where the photograph still rested, and she gently touched the edge of the frame before saying that her mother kept it safe because she believed one day it would matter again, and that believing was the only reason she never let the past disappear completely. William stepped toward the photograph and picked it up once more, studying it with a different understanding now, noticing not just the faces but the emotion captured inside it. And he realized that what he had once thought was a forgotten chapter was in fact an unfinished promise. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer heavy. It was steady, as if the truth had finally taken its place without resistance. William turned toward the window again and looked out at the river, and this time the memory that surfaced was no longer fragmented or distant. It was complete, showing him not just a moment, but a life that had once been real in every sense that mattered. He saw Elena standing beside him, not as a ghost of the past, but as someone who had once shared the same space, the same hope, and the same belief that tomorrow would hold more than yesterday. And that realization brought a stillness inside him that felt both painful and peaceful at the same time. Maya stood quietly beside him now, no longer just observing but present within the meaning of everything that had been uncovered, and William finally spoke her name again, not as a question, but as acceptance. He told her softly that he remembered now, not everything at once, but enough to understand what had been lost and what had been waiting, and Maya simply nodded as if that moment had always been inevitable. The light through the window shifted slightly as the afternoon moved forward, and the house that had once felt abandoned now felt complete in a way that no modern structure ever could be. William lowered himself slowly to sit near the table, placing the key down with careful hands, and as it rested there, it no longer felt like a tool of discovery, but like a symbol of return. Maya sat across from him, her expression calm but present, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to unlock, only something left to understand. William finally looked at her with a clarity that came from acceptance rather than explanation, and he understood that the truth he had been chasing was never meant to surprise him. It was meant to bring him back. And in that quiet space between memory and reality, father and daughter remained together, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two lives finally aligned by the return of what had never truly disappeared.